The phone system serving customer-facing operations across Chicago, Illinois, began the day within normal parameters on a Tuesday in late September, with call volume distributed across banking institutions, utility providers, insurance carriers, municipal service departments, and healthcare networks operating under standard staffing allocations determined weeks in advance based on historical demand modeling and seasonal adjustment factors. Morning call initiation rates between 7 and 9 a.m. tracked within 4% of projected volume across most categories, with queue depths reflecting typical variance for a weekday following a long weekend when deferred inquiries and billing cycle overlaps produced moderate but manageable increases in inbound traffic. Automatic call distribution systems routed connections through interactive voice response trees designed to segment callers by inquiry type, account status, and service category before placement in agent queues, with average speed to answer holding between 2 and 4 minutes for most high-volume centers during the initial hours of operation. Staffing levels reflected planned availability minus normal absence rates, with agent login counts reaching approximately 92% of scheduled capacity by 8:30 a.m., a figure consistent with typical adherence metrics and within acceptable variance for operational planning purposes. Call abandonment rates during early morning hours remained below 8%, indicating that queue persistence was functioning as designed and that callers were willing to wait through hold periods that had not yet extended beyond tolerance thresholds embedded in customer behavior assumptions. The system was processing calls, transferring requests, and completing transactions at rates that matched throughput expectations derived from capacity planning models that accounted for agent availability, average handle time, and queue management protocols that had been refined over multiple years of operational data collection and performance analysis. Between 9:30 and 11 a.m., call volume increased across nearly all customer service categories simultaneously, with financial services experiencing a 17% rise over projected demand, utility inquiries climbing 14% above forecast, and insurance-related calls exceeding baseline estimates by 11%, while municipal service lines recorded increases of 19% compared to the same period in previous weeks. The convergence of these increases was not immediately apparent to individual call center operations, as each organization monitored its own queue metrics and staffing performance in isolation, with no cross-sector visibility into simultaneous demand patterns affecting parallel service infrastructures throughout the metropolitan area. Agent occupancy rates, which measure the percentage of logged-in time spent handling calls or performing after-call work, climbed from typical ranges of 75 to 80% toward sustained levels above 88%, reducing the buffer capacity normally available to absorb short-term volume spikes without proportional increases in wait time. Average speed to answer began extending beyond design thresholds, reaching 7 to 9 minutes for some banking customer service lines and 6 to 8 minutes for utility account inquiries, while interactive voice response systems continued to provide estimated wait time announcements based on recent averages rather than real-time queue depth calculations, resulting in hold time estimates that understated actual delay by 3 to 5 minutes in many cases. Call abandonment rates rose to 12% for some organizations and 15% for others, but these figures remained below the critical thresholds that would trigger immediate escalation protocols or emergency staffing mobilization, falling instead into a range that operational supervisors interpreted as elevated but manageable demand requiring monitoring rather than intervention. Retry behavior among callers who abandoned and redialed contributed additional volume to already extended queues, creating a feedback mechanism in which longer wait times increased abandonment, which in turn generated repeat call attempts that further extended wait times, though this dynamic was not yet severe enough to produce visible system stress or prompt coordinated response measures. By midday, the cumulative effect of sustained above-forecast call volume, limited agent availability, and increasing queue persistence had moved multiple customer service operations into a state where new calls were being answered at a rate slower than new calls were arriving, causing queue depths to grow continuously rather than fluctuate around stable averages as system design anticipated. Banking call centers serving retail customers reported hold queues extending to 45 and 60 calls deep in some skill groups, with average speed to answer reaching 12 to 16 minutes for general account inquiries and 14 to 19 minutes for fraud reporting lines. figures that represented delays approximately 3 to 4 times longer than the thresholds used in service level agreement definitions and capacity planning assumptions. Utility companies fielded increasing volumes of billing inquiries and service connection requests that could not be deflected to automated channels, as many callers had already attempted self-service options before resorting to phone contact, resulting in a concentration of complex or exception-based inquiries that required longer average handle times and reduced the throughput capacity of available agents. Insurance providers managing claims intake and policy service inquiries experienced similar patterns, with hold times extending into the 15 to 22-minute range for some lines, while callback request systems accumulated backlogs of up to 180 requests awaiting return calls that were scheduled based on agent availability projections that were no longer valid under current demand conditions. Municipal service departments handling permit inquiries, payment processing, and general information requests recorded queue depths that exceeded queue management system display limits in some instances, with hold times reaching 25 to 30 minutes for certain categories of inquiry, while staffing remained fixed at levels determined by budget allocations and shift schedules that could not be adjusted on an intraday basis. The afternoon period between 1 and 3 p.m. did not bring the typical volume reduction that operational models predicted based on historical calling patterns, as retry attempts from earlier abandoned calls and deferred inquiries from callers who had postponed contact after encountering long hold times during morning hours sustained inbound traffic at levels that prevented queue recovery, even as total new caller volume moderated slightly from late morning peaks. Agent availability declined from morning levels as scheduled breaks, lunch rotations, and afternoon training sessions removed staff from production queues according to pre-planned schedules that had been set weeks in advance and could not be modified without violating labor agreements or exceeding shift length limits that would trigger overtime costs and fatigue-related performance degradation. Call centers operating with tiered support structures found that frontline agents increasingly needed to transfer calls to specialized teams or supervisory personnel for resolution of complex inquiries that could not be addressed through standard scripts, creating secondary queues within internal transfer pathways that added 2 to 5 minutes of additional hold time per call beyond the initial wait to reach the first agent. Average handle time increased by 8 to 12% across multiple organizations as agents managed callers who had already waited extended periods and required more detailed explanations or expressed frustration that lengthened interaction duration, further reducing the effective call completion rate and preventing queue depths from declining despite sustained agent effort and normal productivity levels measured by individual transaction quality and accuracy metrics. Estimated wait time announcements provided by automated systems became increasingly unreliable as queue dynamics shifted beyond the parameters of the algorithms used to calculate projected delays, with some systems announcing 10-minute waits for queues that actually required 30 to 40 minutes to clear, while other systems stopped providing time estimates entirely and defaulted to generic messages indicating high call volume and encouraging callers to try again later or use alternative service channels that were themselves experiencing increased traffic. By mid-afternoon, the operational state of customer service phone systems across multiple sectors had shifted from elevated demand with extended delays to a condition where the functional capacity to answer calls within any reasonable time frame had been effectively exhausted, though the systems themselves remained technically operational with no hardware failures, network outages, or software malfunctions detected by monitoring tools designed to identify infrastructure problems rather than throughput insufficiency. Callers who remained in queues experienced hold times that extended beyond 40 minutes for some banking services, 35 to 50 minutes for certain utility account lines, and 40 to 60 minutes for insurance claims reporting, with music on hold and periodic system announcements providing the only indication that calls remained connected and had not been dropped by network errors. Callback systems that had been designed to allow callers to request a return call rather than waiting in queue had accumulated request volumes that exceeded the capacity of available agents to fulfill within the same business day, with some organizations logging callback commitments that would require 6 to 8 hours of agent time to complete, while current agent availability projected only 2 to 3 hours of capacity remaining before end of shift. The cumulative effect was a service environment in which new callers entering the queue had virtually no prospect of reaching an agent before close of business, while existing callers who had already invested 20 or 30 minutes of hold time faced the decision to continue waiting with uncertain outcome or abandon their call and forfeit the time already spent. A dynamic that transformed the queue from a temporary waiting mechanism into a persistent state that callers could not exit successfully regardless of patience or determination. Internal escalation protocols that would normally trigger emergency response measures had thresholds defined in terms of system outages, critical service failures, or specific numeric targets for abandonment rates and service levels, none of which had been technically breached despite the practical cessation of effective service, as queues remained operational and some calls continued to be answered even as the majority of callers received no response. Between 4 and 6 p.m., as business hours began closing for some organizations and approaching end of shift for others, the call queue situation evolved into a terminal state where remaining agent capacity was insufficient to address even a fraction of accumulated demand before scheduled close of operations. Banking institutions with customer service hours ending at 6 p.m. faced queues containing callers who had been holding for 40 to 70 minutes, with new calls still arriving at rates that prevented any reduction in queue depth, despite agents continuing to process calls at normal productivity rates until their shifts concluded. Some systems provided automated announcements informing callers that hold times might extend beyond business hours and suggesting they call back the following day, but these announcements were delivered to callers already 30 or 40 minutes into their wait, creating situations where abandoning the call meant forfeiting substantial invested time, while continuing to hold offered no guaranteed resolution before service hours ended. Utility companies operating extended service hours until 8 p.m. experienced similar dynamics, with queue depths remaining above 100 calls in some categories, even as the rate of new call arrivals decreased with advancing evening hours, indicating that backlog clearance would not occur within the available service window. Callback request systems that had promised return calls within a specified time frame began generating automated notifications to callers indicating that their requests could not be fulfilled as scheduled and would be carried over to the following business day, effectively converting a same-day service commitment into a next-day promise without any mechanism to prioritize these deferred requests over new demand that would arrive the following morning. Organizations that maintained 24-hour service lines transitioned their operations to overnight staffing levels that were typically 30 to 40% of daytime capacity, ensuring that queue depths would persist through the night and into the following morning without any realistic prospect of clearing the backlog before new business day demand resumed. As customer service operations concluded their business day and transitioned to reduced or overnight staffing, the accumulated call volume that had not been addressed remained in system logs as abandoned calls, expired callback requests, and incomplete queue entries that would inform next-day demand projections and operational adjustments. The total volume of calls that had been initiated but not successfully connected to an agent for that single day was estimated to exceed 32,000 attempts across major banking institutions, utility providers, insurance carriers, and municipal service departments serving the Chicago metropolitan area, a figure derived from call detail records showing initiated calls, queue entry timestamps, and abandonment or disconnect events occurring before agent connection. The average hold time experienced by callers who did reach an agent had been approximately 23 minutes across tracked categories, while the median hold time for all calls, including those abandoned, was approximately 17 minutes, indicating that a substantial portion of caller effort had been expended without achieving the intended purpose of the call. Organizations reviewing call center performance metrics for the day identified service level achievement rates ranging from 12% to 38% against standard targets of 75 to 80% of calls answered within defined timeframes, marking the worst single-day service performance recorded in operational histories spanning multiple years for several institutions. The failure had occurred without any triggering incident that could be identified in system logs, network performance data, or staffing records, appearing instead as the compound effect of marginally elevated demand across multiple categories, persisting for several hours beyond the duration that existing capacity buffers and queue tolerance could accommodate. No emergency had been declared, no crisis response mobilized, and no public notification issued, as the situation manifested as severe service degradation rather than complete outage, and remained within the operational authority of individual call center management to address through standard escalation procedures that had proven insufficient for the scale and duration of the demand pattern. Post-event analysis conducted by internal operations teams and third-party workforce management consultants examined call arrival patterns, agent availability, queue behavior, and system performance data to determine what specific factors had combined to produce the service failure and whether the event represented a predictable outcome of existing capacity planning assumptions or an anomalous convergence of independent variables that exceeded reasonable operational forecasting. Call volume analysis revealed that while individual categories of inquiry had exceeded forecasts by 10 to 19%, no single category had experienced demand that would have overwhelmed capacity if it had occurred in isolation, suggesting that the failure resulted from simultaneous increases across multiple service areas rather than from extreme demand in any particular sector. Staffing availability on the day in question had been within 2% of scheduled levels, with absence rates and adherence metrics showing no significant deviation from normal patterns, indicating that the shortfall was not caused by unexpected staff unavailability, but rather by insufficient baseline staffing to handle the observed demand level. Average handle time for completed calls had increased by approximately 9% compared to weekly averages, attributed partly to caller frustration resulting from extended hold times and partly to a higher proportion of complex inquiries that could not be resolved through first contact resolution and required transfers or additional research time. Queue management system performance showed no technical defects, with call routing, skill-based assignment, and priority sequencing all functioning as designed, though the algorithms used to calculate estimated wait times had proven inadequate when queue depths exceeded the ranges for which they had been calibrated. The analysis identified that capacity planning models had been based on demand forecasts with confidence intervals that assumed volume variations would remain within plus or minus 15% of baseline projections on 95% of days, with contingency plans triggered only when thresholds exceeded 20% above forecast, creating a gap between normal operations and emergency response that allowed the observed demand level to persist without activating additional capacity measures. Further investigation into the specific conditions of the day examined whether external factors such as billing cycles, service disruptions, policy changes, or public events had contributed to the elevated call volume, with findings indicating that multiple minor factors had coincided without any single cause dominating the demand pattern. Several large employers in the Chicago area had processed payroll deposits that day, leading to increased banking inquiries related to account access and transaction verification during morning hours. A utility company had issued estimated bills for a subset of customers following meter reading delays in certain service zones, generating questions about bill accuracy and adjustment procedures. An insurance carrier had begun implementing a policy documentation update that required existing customers to verify coverage details, producing inbound calls from policyholders seeking clarification on notices they had received. Municipal service departments had reopened permit application processes following a system upgrade that had caused a multi-day pause in online submission capabilities, concentrating deferred requests into a compressed timeframe. None of these factors individually represented unusual operational challenges, but their temporal overlap created compounded demand that existing capacity allocation methods had not anticipated because forecasting models treated each service category independently rather than accounting for potential correlation between demand drivers affecting multiple sectors simultaneously. workforce scheduling practices that optimized labor costs by maintaining staffing at levels adequate for forecast demand plus a modest buffer had left organizations vulnerable to multi-hour demand elevations that exceeded buffer capacity, particularly when agent availability could not be increased on short notice due to shift scheduling constraints, union agreements, and training requirements that limited the pool of qualified staff who could be mobilized for same-day emergency coverage. The event demonstrated that system resilience to demand variation was lower than operational assumptions had estimated, with effective service breakdown occurring at volume levels only 12 to 16% above forecast, rather than at the 20% threshold where contingency protocols were designed to activate. Documentation compiled following the service disruption included recommendations for revised capacity planning methodologies incorporating correlation analysis between demand drivers, expanded staffing buffers calibrated to accommodate sustained rather than momentary volume increases, and modified escalation thresholds that would trigger additional capacity mobilization at earlier stages of queue accumulation before hold times extended beyond recovery potential. Proposals for enhanced callback system capacity suggested separating callback request intake from fulfillment tracking to prevent commitment backlogs from accumulating, while queue management system updates were specified to improve estimated wait time accuracy under high-volume conditions and provide more granular status information to callers making abandonment decisions. Service-level agreement definitions were reviewed for alignment with actual operational capabilities, with discussions of whether existing targets remained achievable under updated demand assumptions or whether contractual commitments needed revision to reflect realistic performance boundaries given staffing and budget constraints. Internal audits documented that while no service-level agreements had been formally breached due to force majeure clauses covering circumstances beyond reasonable control, the event had exposed gaps between customer expectations for response time and organizational capability to maintain those response times under moderately elevated demand lasting several hours. The reports noted that similar conditions could recur with sufficient frequency to warrant preemptive capacity adjustments rather than reactive response protocols, though implementation of such adjustments would require budget increases that organizational leadership had not yet approved pending cost-benefit analysis comparing customer service performance metrics against labor expenditure and revenue impact. The documentation concluded with planning assumptions revised to incorporate longer queue tolerance periods, higher abandonment rate thresholds, and expanded demand variance ranges in forecasting models, effectively acknowledging that the service levels previously considered standard would no longer be maintained during demand conditions that had previously been classified as routine operational variance rather than exceptional circumstances requiring emergency response.